Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. So my name is Lauren and I run demand gen here at Cybereason, and thanks for joining our SOC talk on ransomware mythbusting, where my friends here are going to bust some common myths about ransomware that keep coming up. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. First of all, this session is recorded, so you will receive the recording 24 hours after the session. Any questions, just use the question panel in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll try to get to those at the end during our Q&A. And also for a little bit of fun, it's a little bit interactive today. We're going to have, as we go through each myth, we're going to launch a poll, and before we reveal whether something is a truth or a myth, you can actually guess in the poll. So we'd love for you to participate. It should be really fun. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lital Asher-Dotan, the Senior Director of Marketing here at Cybereason, and as well as Ross Rasici, the Senior Director of Intelligence Services at Cybereason. Thanks for joining, guys.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Hello, everyone on the line. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to discuss ransomware today, as it seemed to be it was the hot topic of 2016, definitely was in the news in 2017, and it seems to have a comeback in the last few days or weeks, with the news coming up on the Atlanta City attack. They've been suffering for over a week now from a persisting ransomware attack, and it seems like there is a devastating damage over there. And last night we heard about presumably some machines at Boeing that were affected with WannaCry. Kind of had a retro effect coming up here, and we were joking about it earlier that we were pulling those slides talking about ransomware, and now it's a thing again. Well, 2017 definitely been the year of massive ransomware attack. WannaCry was the first, followed up by NotPetya that ended up being a wiper attack, then BadRabbit attack. All of them were in the news and making headlines, and it kind of like broke out of the scheme of regular cyber attacks that we hear about once in a while. Those things were really devastating because of their effect and the widespread effect that they had. We wanted to talk today about all the myths that are around ransomware and what are the trends we predict we're going to see in 2018. But Ross, I'm very happy to have you with me. You've been researching those trends for a while and looking at the players behind that. Looking back at 2017, do you think that it was an abnormal year? Is it common what we've seen?
Yeah, so I think looking back at the last couple of years, 2017 is definitely an abnormality, both in terms of the delivery methods as well as the scale in which the attacks were created. We haven't seen really a more damaging year in terms of ransomware and their derivative disk wipers than we saw in 2017. And the newsworthiness of 2017 overall from a cybersecurity standpoint is one that just makes it stand out, whether you're talking the Equifax breach, which had nothing to do with the ransomware, or the WannaCrys and NotPetyas. 2017 was, I think, the headline year for cybersecurity, and just the rate at which these attacks are happening and the true impact that we're seeing. I mean, NotPetya was in the billions of damages. It was probably the most damaging wiper attack that we've seen ever. And so I think 2017 was abnormal for a lot of reasons. And when you're looking at the ransomware trend, I think it is kind of a penultimate data point that we can talk about.
So, you know, after the devastation of 2017, a lot of people thought, okay, 2018 is going to be another worse year, which leads us to the first myth that we're going to discuss. And with that, we're going to launch a poll. So what do you think, guys? Is it a truth or is it a myth that ransomware is still growing and it's on a growing trend? I'm very curious to see what the audience think, and then we're going to share with you the reality.
Give it another, 15
Okay.
seconds, 20 seconds.
Okay. So let's give it a sec. And let's talk about, is it a truth or a myth, Ross?
So I think thankfully it's a myth. Despite the fact that 2017 was a banner year for ransomware intrusions, if you look at the actual data points going back to 2015, where kind of ransomware hit its zenith, it had the most variants that we'd ever seen. There's a steady decline from 2017 through 27, or starting in 2015 through 2017, that is a roughly 50% decrease. So we're seeing roughly 350 different unique variant families of ransomware in 2015. By 2017, you're down to 170 or so. And 2018 continues that shrinkage, although not at quite the same rate. So when you're looking at the actual new variants, the capabilities that are being baked in, we're seeing a consolidation in ransomware, which is a good thing from a defender's perspective because it's more of a known quantity and there's less kind of chaff that you have to deal with, and there's less likelihood that you're going to see something completely new. As far as the actual infection rates, that looks more like a U-shaped curve where you had a real high number in 2015. Throughout 2016, you had a decline. And then midway through 2017, because of WannaCry, because of NotPetya, because of Bad Rabbit, you saw a temporary spike. And then it started to slide back down near the tail end of 2017. And it's continuing to decline into 2018. So overall, I think we've kind of hit the high watermark of ransomware, both from a technology side in terms of number of variants, and also its widespread usage and infection rate. Now, obviously, we're still going to have outliers because it is still an effective tool where it's going to grab headlines like the Atlanta government, like potentially Boeing. But in terms of the overall spread and growth, I think we're finally coming out the other side of it, and it's dropping back into the same pool as your banking Trojans and all the other malware that we all know and hate. It's no longer a large outlier. It's just one of many.
Do you think there is anything to do with prices of Bitcoin and the ability to monetize on those attacks? Have we seen a correlation between the trends?
Yeah, so it was interesting. And a couple of security researchers have done a lot more research on this than I have, but it looks like a lot of the ransomware guys, especially the ones emanating from Eastern Europe or targeting less affluent countries, have started to move away from cryptocurrencies because of the wild price valuations. It was no longer a reliable method of payment because the request of $250 to unlock your computer could be a minute fraction of a Bitcoin, or it could be a Bitcoin, and the inconsistency in pricing and the wild swings made the ransomware authors feel like, especially in poorer countries, they weren't going to be able to get into the market to actually pay the ransoms, which doesn't help the person trying to monetize the actual malicious behavior. And so that actually helped kill ransomware in a way that I don't think anybody was really expecting.
That's funny because the prices of Bitcoin raised because of ransomware, and the raise in the price of Bitcoin is killing it back. That's an interesting vicious cycle for that, which is good for us. Wonderful. Let's move to the next myth. You ready? Okay. So, guys, what do you think on the line? Are we failing to protect against ransomware? Is it truth or a myth? I've been hearing this over and over again. I've been in so many conferences in which they say, this is a threat that we're not mitigating well. This is a threat ahead of us. This is a big thing. We're failing. I wonder what people think, and do we think that security is handling ransomware well? And this is interesting. So from The poll results that are coming in, I must say, I'm very happy to see that it's almost half and half. Half of you think it's truth and half of you think it's a myth. And it's good. I think that I'm happy to see that people are optimistic about where we are as an industry.
Yeah, no, that's a higher response rate than I was expecting, that's for sure. I would say that when it comes to ransomware, the cybersecurity industry is actually doing better than in most areas. And that has to do with both kind of the recognition of it being a public menace in a way that a lot of other types of malware, a lot of different types of intrusions don't meet that threshold. And you've seen kind of a groundswell response from the cybersecurity industry overall as a result of that. Whether it's a company's putting out free utilities like Ransom Free that helps prevent the initial infection, which helps reduce the monetization value of ransomware, or it's all the security researchers on the back end that figure out ways to break the encryption and decrypt files once you are infected so you don't actually have to pay the ransom. There's a lot more freeware floating about regarding this than really any other targeted threat that we have. And even when you look at the headlines of 2017, WannaCry, NotPetya, within 48 hours, you had essentially hot fixes for people who weren't buying security products in order to inoculate themselves. And that's really something you see with almost no other type of malware, this groundswell of trying to defang it and render it useless, because I think back in 2014, 2015, the cybersecurity industry looked around and said, this is going to be an uncontrollable disaster if we don't unify forces, work across the industry and try to tackle it. And in this rare occasion, I think we actually succeeded more often than not. It's always going to be a cat and mouse game. There's always going to be a bit of whack-a-mole as new variants come out. But as the security industry keeps its attention on this and continues to try to combat it, I think we're getting a better handle on this than most other variants of malware and types of intrusions.
I actually love it. I think we should have as an industry this as a case study of how the whole industry should fight threats as they emerge. Your point about freeware, about intelligence, about the ability to have quickly investigate a new ransomware that comes out and issue a fix. This is something that we should strive doing with other threats as well. And I think we have a lot to learn, and legislators should look at it as well as a good way of treating other threats in the future. Let's hope that this will continue that way and we'll keep it that way. So good and kudos for the industry so far with that. Okay, moving on. So we did say that ransomware has a little bit of a decrease, and we see this trend. The myth is that, or people believe that crypto miners attacks are the next big thing. What do you think, guys? True or false? True or a myth? Okay, results are coming up. Okay, I'll give it another second, and it's kind of shifting. Thank you for your results. So most people say it's true that it is a replacement for ransomware attack. What do you say, Ross?
So the technology, I would say, is definitely a replacement, because a lot of the utilities that are being used, the way the malware behaves is very similar. But as far as a shift in actual capabilities and a replacement for the ransomware kind of deluge that we saw, I think that's the myth. I don't think crypto miners are ever going to reach the same level of investment from a malware authorship standpoint or a deployment standpoint that we saw with ransomware, simply because the monetary payoff for these types of tools is directly tied to the crypto markets. When Bitcoin is trading near 20,000 bucks a Bitcoin, it makes sense to get a fraction of the Bitcoin mined, because that's a decent payday before things start getting patched and you lose your malware. When it's trading at below $10,000, it becomes less of an economic incentive.
It's a lot of effort.
Yeah, and you're burning a lot of tools for a relatively low payout compared to other attack vectors that they have at their disposal. And so I think just like Bitcoin turned into a bit of a bubble, as long as the market doesn't change substantially, crypto miners are going to fall the same way. And it's going to be an aberration of the economics of cryptocurrency and less a sustained trend that we thought it might have been near the tail end of 2017, beginning of 2018, simply because the money isn't there as readily as some of the other things that they could be doing with their same time and effort.
It is just a completely different return on investment model. With ransomware, it's easy to produce a ransomware. You hit the market and you get some profit. The effort you have to mine blockchain, it's so much harder to do. So the economics should be completely different. It's not one-to-one with that comparison.
Yep, that's exactly right. And also, you need some level of persistence to actually use the resources. A lot of fractional usage isn't that useful. And so they need some stability in their botnet, and that's just not the case in most infections these days.
So we'll see it happening, but definitely not a replacement for the attackers to monetize on.
We actually just had a pretty good question, if I may cut in. One of our listeners writes, even though ransomware attacks may be declining, the fact that Bitcoin is worth 20 or 30 times what it was when cyber criminals were requesting $300 suggests financial rewards could actually be higher, even though there are fewer attacks. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so tracking the money is really hard to do with cryptocurrency in general and with ransomware infections, just because the money that's paid out is a lot harder to track because you don't have good insight, especially from the cybersecurity side of things, to know who just abandoned their hard drive, who paid, who was able to decrypt it with a free utility. But you definitely do see anybody who sat on cryptocurrency, especially doing this back in like 2015, made out like a bandit. Even if they retired in 2015, if they made $100,000 in Bitcoin back then, and if they sold at the right time, they're millionaires multiple times over. So the cost and the profit associated with it definitely increased. But you got to remember that as Bitcoin rises and falls and the other cryptocurrencies rise and fall, they are gaining and losing capital just like all the other investors. And so anybody who invested and tried to get it at the high water mark essentially lost money on that investment on the slide. And so they're as prone to the market volatility as anybody who's buying Bitcoin as an actual investment vehicle. So there are some guys who definitely made a lot of money off of this. And I'm willing to bet there are quite a few people who actually lost a lot of money in the tail end of 2017 as well.
And the hardest part is to cash it out.
Right.
So they have Bitcoins. The question is, are they going to cash it out?
Right. And how you avoid the traditional financial laws and that kind of stuff that brought down carbon tax.
Exactly. We just saw last week, again, being brought down by trying to cash out the money they made. All righty. Let's move on. Our next myth. So a lot of us, and I think this is a common belief, think that most of the infections of infection ways of ransomware are kind of via stupid mechanism, be it drive-bys, click-throughs, spear phishing, and so. Is this true, guys? Do you also believe that most of the ways to get infected by a ransomware is just, very stupid user behavior that we cannot control as security experts? The answers are coming in. And again, we kind of have, so half of you say it's true and half say, no, that's a myth. So we've been struggling on that. I think that it's true and false.
Yeah, so I would say stupid user tricks are definitely responsible for a lot of infections. Spear phishing is still the predominant way all infections get started. You have users going to sketchy websites, kind of your traditional things that you associate with grandma getting ransomware. But we also saw an evolution over the last few years using exploit kits, using the worms for WannaCry and a couple other variants. They're using more technical means, more sophisticated capabilities for delivery mechanisms that bypass some of your traditional controls and also ignore the stupid user. Because as security awareness comes up and as endpoint protections get better, the stupid user becomes a less reliable intrusion vector. And so to spread their ransomware, you saw them use drive-bys and a couple more sophisticated things, and they kept on moving up that sophistication chain in an attempt to keep the monetization at roughly the same scale. And we actually saw the number of infected web pages and spear phishing emails in relative terms decline compared to those other things over the last year or so, simply because they were becoming less effective. So stupid users are always going to be a problem. We're never going to be able to get rid of the human in cybersecurity, but I do think we saw an evolution in 2017 of more sophisticated intrusion vectors, and I think that that's going to continue as a trend in 2018, especially as some of the guys who are less sophisticated get out of the business as the monetization gets worse and worse.
And it's important to remember that as more exploit kits are available, it is easy for those ransomware writers to plug and play with them, take one kit and use it. It is extremely important once a vulnerability is being revealed to patch it as fast as possible. We have seen it with NotPetya and WannaCry, the exploitation of the Eternal Blue vulnerabilities. We think that even though we are trying to be optimistic and say, hey, ransomware is declining, if there'll be a great opportunity with a major vulnerability to kind of put it together and mix it together with a powerful ransomware tool, hell, this is going to be widespread, and this will take one night to get out. We've seen it, and this will happen again. So stupid mechanisms are out there, but the real concern is that once there is a major vulnerability, it will very soon be attached to as an intrusion mechanism to ransomware tools and other tools like wipers, like other more persistent tools, depending on the interest of the attacker. But we cannot be complacent, and we cannot stop thinking about those things, because they offer a very lucrative business model to cash out fast.
Yeah, this is definitely not a victory lap. We've, as the cybersecurity industry and governments, frankly, have done a good job at containing its growth, but it's still out there, and you're still going to see a lot of headlines associated with it. The thing that we're seeing is a trend downward in its usage and the overall infection rate, but it's still in the hundreds of thousands. This is not by any means a contained or solved problem. It's just not growing at the exponential rate that we all feared that it would, and it's becoming contained. So if you think of it kind of like forest fires out in the West, you talk about containing the forest fire and slowly bringing it down. I think we've got like 30–40% containment, which is good. It's not spreading at the same rate, but there's still a lot of work to be done before we really stamp it out and can call it cleared.
I think another point that we should be aware of is infection through third parties. And so we have seen it with NotPetya, the MEDOC backdoor. This is something to always keep in mind. In addition to patching of vulnerabilities, there is always the risk with third-party vendor services that infection will come through that. We've seen it. We actually believe that supply chain attacks are on the rise, and some of them may be used for wipers and ransomware dropping. That's something that security guys should be putting an eye on.
Yeah, get as close to zero trust as possible in your networks, and that'll help immensely. But especially in geopolitical hotspots like the Ukraine, where you've got governments going against each other and using corporations as proxies, I think we're going to see a lot more of this stuff, especially when Russia's involved. They like disk wipers. It's a nice signaling tool, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that, especially using the supply chain access that they already have. We saw it in the Ukraine. We saw it in Korea. Supply chain is going to be a continual issue, and it's going to be more on the destructive wiper side than the pure ransomware, but it plays in both the same delivery mechanisms.
Okay, so if ransomware is not the next big thing in the attack landscape, what is? What should we put our bets and get ready for when we look ahead of us?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question to answer. Ransomware, I would say, is coming back to the pack, so to speak, in terms of its popularity. So it's coming back into the fold with your banking Trojans, your exploit kits, your adware. And really, when we look at the cyber criminal market overall, we look at it from the monetization standpoint. What is the most scalable monetization for the least amount of effort on the cyber criminal side? Because it's a scalability issue for them. They're trying to make as much money as possible with the least amount of work, just like every other corporation. And right now, we're not seeing a trend that's an easy breakout from that pack. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of experimentation. Crypto miners was the early bet for a lot of folks because of the high price of cryptocurrencies. Now that that bubble's burst, that's kind of been undermined. I think kind of the next big trend, at least in the short term, partly because of GDPR, partly because of a couple other trends with nation state activity, is the intrusions for ransoming IP and embarrassing information, kind of more of the doxingware type stuff. Because right now we're setting up a unique monetary situation, especially with GDPR, where you can hold data at risk in a way with a hard dollar figure that you couldn't before. And so you're going to see things like the Uber incident where they paid off a hacker and called it a bug bounty. You're going to see more people try to do things like the HBO hack. And it's going to really be up to the private industry to decide how much they're willing to pay, how much they're willing to work in this particular area, and whether this becomes the next big trend, or it's kind of like the crypto miners, where it's a flash in the pan. It looks really scary as a bunch of people try the model, and then it falls back into the flow.
So it's basically up to us as an industry, again, if we work together and we don't pay, probably this will not be a lucrative opportunity. Definitely GDPR is a risk. If companies will decide to pay hackers instead of go to the legislators and announce that they've been breached, that is a slippery slope for us to open a trend.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think, especially when it's talking about cybercrime-related intrusions, it really is up to us to undermine the payout for them. That's what they gravitate to. And once they realize there's easy money involved, you're going to see a lot of people jump on that bandwagon. So if we can undermine the payout aspect of all of this, you're going to prevent a big bubble happening like we saw with ransomware. And I don't think there's any technology on the horizon today that has the same potential game-changing impact that ransomware had several years ago.
What about wipers? We have seen the Winter Olympics being hit. Is that something we'll see more of?
Unfortunately, I think so. I think wipers fall into two categories right now. One is the nation state behavior that we've talked about a little bit with Russia, and also North Korea's done it, Iran's done it. There are a lot of wiping attacks that are essentially on record. And it seems to be this carved off enclave of, yes, it's technically a destructive attack, but it seems to be permissible between states to signal displeasure. And that's a really dangerous place for us to be in, especially as the kind of collateral damage of the private sector. And I think especially with the tit for tat exchanges that are happening between Russia and the West right now, you're going to see a couple more of these happen in the first half of this year. It's mostly probably going to be against the UK. Given what's going on there and the upcoming World Cup and a couple other issues. But as we've seen with NotPetya, just because it's focused on one country does not mean it's going to stay there. And we're going to see the same types of global outbreaks because of third-party supply chain risk, because of global operations. And then the other side of it, which to me is actually the more terrifying side, is the adoption by cyber criminals to use it as a cleanup tool. So you used to see them try to blow away logs and try to cover their tracks through a myriad of different ways that were more precise. As the governments got away with it, cyber criminals and your more advanced actors that are going after intellectual property, they're going after targeted information, have realized that they can use these same utilities to blow away a network and prevent the forensic evidence to really reconstruct what was taken, which covers their tracks when they go to try to sell it to somebody else. It's more of a guarantee that the information can't be tracked to whomever's ultimately going to benefit from it. If that trend continues, and we've seen it used a couple times in Asia and a couple other places, that is a very bad development for us, because it takes what used to be a very precise intrusion that is bad for the private sector but survivable, and turns it into something that has not only an R&D impact but also a business operation impact, which we hadn't really seen much of before.
Yeah, that will affect the bottom line if that becomes widespread. Definitely. With that, we are very happy to answer questions for you guys on the line. I think we have already a few of those, Lauren.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. That was great. So yeah, we have a few questions here. So first, most related to what you were just recently talking about, why is black hat work done so much from the Ukraine and Russia versus North America or Asia or Africa or other parts of the world?
I'll tackle this in a couple ways. Your cybercrime networks grew up in former Soviet bloc countries for the most part, for a couple of reasons. One, the Soviet Union invested heavily in your STEM throughout the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had a bunch of people who were engineers and technical and trained in computer science as a budding emerging field, suddenly unemployed. The other thing is, during the 90s, when all these guys were unemployed and seeking employment, you had a rise of a lot of organized crime and a lot of the oligarchs in Russia who could then employ them to do dubious activity, to put it nicely. And so you just have kind of the perfect breeding ground of a high talented resource pool and a lot of need and questionable ethics in terms of how you operate. And it kind of created this perfect breeding ground for cybercrime activity. And there was very weak law enforcement on top of it all. So these guys weren't actually being punished and deterred. And it became more or less an agreed upon status quo that if you hack outside of the country, you're less likely to be punished. And if you happen to know somebody in the former KGB, now the FSB, even better. That being said, there are a lot of cybercrime groups operating internationally. Europe is what we hear about the most because they tend to go after Western Europe and the United States a lot, and because it kind of feeds into that old Cold War narrative that we're all used to. Asia has rampant cybercrime. It just tends to be more focused internal to Asia. And a lot of that actually has to do with linguistics. It's really hard to spearfish somebody in a language that you don't know how to speak. And so a lot of the Chinese cybercrime focuses on the Chinese-speaking dysphoria and its regional neighbors, where they can kind of fudge the spearfishing and that kind of stuff. You have a lot of cybercrime in Latin America, but again, it tends to be internal to those countries. Brazil has a rampant cybercrime industry that focuses on the banking industry, but it's mostly focused in Latin America for linguistics and a bunch of other reasons. So I think we see a regionalization of cybercrime overall, and the Russians just tend to be the highest threshold because they've been doing it for a very long time and they have a lot of education in it.
Excellent. Another question, similar in a similar theme to that. One of our listeners writes, possibly the next big thing we need to be extremely concerned about from the cyber attack standpoint is invasion of infrastructure. There have been reliable reports that cyber criminals have been infiltrating power grids recently in the US. The question is, when will they compromise them, not if? What are your thoughts?
So I'd say they've already compromised them. It's right, not a win. It's when do they make a mistake? And that's really what it comes down to. Most of the focus for industrial controls and power grids and that kind of stuff have to do with nation state actors. And that's kind of the geopolitics playing out of deterrence and having a lever to pull to prevent somebody else from taking an action you don't want to. You saw during the election stuff in 2016, the United States leaked a story saying we have the ability to shut down Russia's power grid if they keep this stuff up. You saw the report from DHS saying the Russians have hacked the US ICS power grid. It's kind of the same tit for tat type stuff of we have the red button if we need it. The thing that is more concerning to me is the cyber criminals who realize that you can hold that infrastructure at risk and extol a very large ransom as a result of that. And we've seen it in the oil and natural gas industry a few times where a hacker has gotten in and said, I have control, pay me or else. We haven't ever seen somebody execute the or else. At some point that's going to happen, and that's a very bad day for everybody when it does. And I don't think that's something that we're going to be able to really stop because the groups that are going after ICS tend to be very hands-on and very low and slow. It's usually not your big spread ransomware campaign that's noisy. That's not exclusive, but for the most part, at least up until this point, the guys who've been successful have been interactive. And that's a level of threat that goes well beyond your bots and your worms and that kind of stuff.
Got it. And someone asks, and I think you mentioned this in the beginning, Latal. Someone's asking, what are your thoughts on the, if you want to comment on the ransomware attack on the city of Atlanta? What are your anything special there? Any thoughts you have?
So, I mean, I obviously do not have access to their data. I'm not involved in that investigation. It seems like just an unfortunate situation, and it's one of those things that ultimately comes down to budget more than anything else in most cases. I'll talk in generalities why city governments, state governments tend to be more susceptible to stuff. It goes back to budget. At the end of the day, when you outline stuff, you have your essential services and then everything else. And as budgets continue to get cut because of the recession and other things, they're already operating on razor thin margins. They don't necessarily have the ability to do an entire network backup all the time. They don't have the money to spend on redundancy because of tax income and that kind of stuff. And this is unfortunately what they're left with. They have none of the best security practices because they've gotten away for so long with not having them, and it hasn't bitten them. And when it does, you suddenly see a massive spend on the cybersecurity side of things, but by then it's too late. And I think that's what really all provincial, local, city, state governments have to deal with is how much is this disruption really going to impact us and whether that's worth denying some other critical service. And when you're looking at those trade-offs, it gets really difficult to justify redundancy, which is really what you need to prevent ransomware.
I would add to that there's a little bit of and I don't want to comment specifically on Atlanta, but on all those attacks, the better you are prepared, the better you get out of it. We have seen, I think it was more than a year ago, the attack on the San Francisco Mooney system. The fact that they decided to just let people continue to ride the Mooney without paying until they get back, they had kind of like, it could be that they decided on the spot, but they had a business plan to maintain the business running, even if the IT system is not going on. I don't want to comment specifically on Atlanta, but it is important that all of us not just fix the IT solution, but kind of have a program in mind for business continuity in case of this kind of devastating attack, destructive attack, ransomware, DDoS, or any of that. It has the business continuity as well as the IT resilience that needs to be taken in mind. And sometimes it's not necessarily the money spent, it's mostly the thinking and planning ahead of time that may have not been there. And that is what making things so painful when it happens. We always talk about get ready, expect the worst, plan, prepare, have this and practice it to see that it works. So I hope that all organizations, whether they have a huge security infrastructure or not even having security infrastructure, just think about what if and what will we do. It's okay to have your systems shut down for a while, but think about what you do with your business in the meantime.
And here's a question. One of our listeners asking if you can talk a little bit about securing exchanges versus securing the blockchain itself. And there's some examples of 51 attacks, quantum attacks, etc.
Yeah, so right now the weak point in crypto seems to be the exchanges and personal wallets, whether it's spear phishing and getting private keys and going after individuals, or finding the exploits in the exchanges themselves and siphoning out a lot of money.
I just heard about man-in-the-middle attacks that enable the exchange.
Yeah, and so the big exchange heists have been going after the money that was left in the exchange that hadn't been downloaded into private wallets, and that's what they're siphoning off. That's the low-hanging fruit for crypto in general. Each particular blockchain is unique in how you attack it. Like Bitcoin, you want 51%. That's the ultimate way to attack it. Is if you control 51% of the blockchain, you control what is considered true and verified, and so you can do whatever you want on there. Breaking the crypto itself, theoretically, is doable. All crypto is breakable. It's a matter of time scale, and as computers continue to get faster, as the advent of the quantum age is theoretically upon us, although I'm a little skeptical of that time frame, traditional crypto is going to become trivial to break. So cryptocurrencies are going to become trivial to break because they're based off of current cryptography. I think that you're not going to see those types of attacks for at least another 10 years or so. It's just easier to go after them in different ways, and that's what's going to undermine them more. And then the other thing that I think talks about this topic a bit, but is completely different, is the recent news about people inserting kiddie porn into the Bitcoin blockchain. That makes it illegal to actually own that piece of blockchain and retain that data, which could undermine the entire chain itself. And so there are all kinds of ways you can mess with blockchain that aren't necessarily attacking the crypto itself.
Exactly. Let's see. So someone's asking about botnets, and they're just asking, are there any specific trends that you see with botnets, and will it ever be used for anything else other than DDoS attacks?
Yeah, so with the botnets, DDoS is the easy go-to. It's the easy button, right? But we're pretty good at defending against that. Even with the meme cache stuff, it was offloaded relatively quickly. It was over a terabit in scale, and it was still handled fairly well. Botnets have evolved beyond DDoS. You saw banking Trojan DDoS or botnets and that kind of stuff. The thing that concerns me the most about botnets is the computers that comprise them themselves. We've seen some threat actor groups, and actually Carbonac was one of them, use access to botnets to pick and choose individual victims and then do a more advanced campaign off of that as a landing point. And that is where I think the evolution of botnets are going to go in general, especially as your traditional monetization scales don't work as well. DDoS isn't as lucrative as it used to be. The banking Trojans are getting caught more frequently and are less lucrative. But selling access to a single machine in a bank or a high-value network for somebody is going to generate the same amount of money every day of the week. And that's where I think you're going to see them start going towards, is creating large stable botnets that have very low resource usage so they don't get caught. And then it's selling access to individual IPs and network ranges and saying, hey, I can get you into Acme Bank. Who's willing to pay for this? Create a bidding war or do a flat rate, $50, whatever it ends up being. And then your more advanced actor who's trying to go after wire transfers or whatever pays a relatively low access fee, and they can skip the initial intrusion and go straight to second stage. And that gives them a high leg up on most security infrastructure, because you're not seeing network scanning, you're not seeing the recon, and you're not catching the stupid user or the download or whatever the initial intrusion vector is, because they've already got that foothold beyond most of your perimeter defenses.
So a couple more questions, and then we'll probably just wrap up. So one is, do you think we'll see an increase in data theft and requests for ransom in order for the data not to be released publicly?
So this is one that we've touched on a couple times now with the talk about GDPR and also bringing up HBO and Uber. I do think we're going to see a lot more of this, both from the monetization cybercriminal side and also from the nation state freelance side. Most of the attacks that we've been able to trace back so far kind of fall in the other duties as assigned type stuff for nation state actors, whether it was the Iranian with HBO, you've seen it with the Yahoo hack in Russia, you've seen the Chinese actors who are ostensibly nation state setting up whole companies to basically hack on the side and sell IP to an internal ecosystem. I think it's viewed, especially in those groups, as a way to have a relatively slow operational tempo as an augmentation to their salary. And so it's not a get-rich-quick scheme, but it's a get-rich while I do the government slog scheme. And I think we're going to see that to continue to expand, especially if it's successful and they receive payouts as a result. The two cases that we saw, Uber and HBO, had very different consequences. But if more people fall in line with Uber than HBO, I think we're going to see a lot more of these guys realize getting access is relatively trivial because they've got nation state toolkits and it's a couple $1 million payday for an operation once a month. That's a pretty good return on investment.
Definitely. So last question, just to round out, and it's a real question, not a plant. Someone writes, what is the best software endpoint to stop a ransomware attack after the stupid email attachment clicker? Not a plant, I swear. I swear,
Well,
everybody.
speaking with a vendor, yes. You want to take it?
This is all you, Latasha.
Well, yes. So, well, obviously, we are selling an anti-ransomware as well as other tools. So first, I actually want to talk about Ransom Free, which is a free tool that we offer for any consumer that has Windows machine and want to protect that. The interesting thing about Ransom Free is that it was built to protect against never before seen ransomware. It has a few baits. It uses canary files as well as other ways to look for the behavior of ransomware, not necessarily to looking at signatures or hashes of the ransomware, so it can really protect from strains that we have not seen before. It also has a component for MBR attacking ransomware types. All this is also implemented in the Cybereason platform. Our platform was built to stop and protect against WannaCry and was proven to stop it from the get-go without seeing it before that. We've seen it successfully protected against MBR writing tools. So we believe we have a very good anti-ransomware tool as well as next-gen antivirus and a complete endpoint detection and response. We'll be happy to discuss it in more details with you guys on the line that may be interested. Again, this is not a sales talk, so we're not here to promote our solution. We just wanted to have Candy talk about ransomware and the trends in the market. But if somebody is interested, shoot us an email and we'll be happy to discuss it and see if it suits you and show you a demo if you will be interested in seeing it. So thanks for the question for whomever that asked it.
Yeah. So that just brings us about to the end. Once again, thanks so much for all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Ross and Lital. That was a great session. Really enjoyed it. Just to round out, so you will receive this recording no later than tomorrow. For those of you that have Gmail, please check in your promotions tab sometimes we do land in there, so just keep an eye out for that. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to Ross or Latal. Their email addresses are up here. You could also reach out to hello@cyberreason. That's our general inbox that we monitor pretty closely. And like Latal mentioned, you can download our free product, Ransom Free. And if you're going to be at RSA, we'd love to see you. So come visit us at booth 1239. We're also having a happy hour at the Thirsty Bear Organic Brewery, which is right around the corner from the Moscone. I'll send some links to that as well in the recording email. You're more than welcome to come. You can RSVP, have some beers, and have a good time. So once again, thanks everybody for joining us today, and I think that does it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.